Thank you very much. Yes, what an interesting time. What an interesting time to come together to discuss probably these somewhat eternal topics of how to organize ourselves, our communities, our people, our neighbors, to move forward. And to move forward on the one hand as a humankind, but also, of course, to move forward as economies, to move forward as communities. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what have we learned from this interesting last 2 years of this shock of COVID, what was new in this, and what was simply an acceleration of the trends we had before. So, some observations, and hopefully maybe we can have some exchange of opinions and not too many speeches. So one observation is when things happened so suddenly in January, February, March, April of 2020, I think many observers would note that multilateral institutions fell to the backstage. There was not many reactions to this virus, to this crisis from the UN, even from the World Health Organization, from the EU in Europe, from ASEAN in Asia. Immediately, nation states stepped up as actors. Moreover, in some nations, very quickly they said the situation is very different by region, so cities, governors are responsible for taking action. So one interesting moment was when crisis hit, mankind actually stepped back very close to localities. Second thought is, of course, globalization, as we know, it's a pendulum. I think before World War I, people discussed that globalization is the only way to go. We should remove all tariffs. Protectionism is bad. There was this golden age of thinking about global trade. Between the two world wars, we know that mankind moved back to quite a lot of protectionism, quite a lot of competition. After World War II, there was this gradual move slowly until the 80s with, let's say, Reagan, Thatcher, Washington Consensus, where everybody said, the less state involvement, the better. The more free market, the better. Globalization is good. Comparative advantage of trade. Ricardo has taught us this in theory. This should work in practice. Privatization is always the answer. But one thing we all would agree, even before COVID, is globalization and global trade, while increasing the wealth stock of the planet, did not actually solve the problems of the wealth of many people or of incomes, and in fact, income disparities on the whole grew. And we saw in many countries the coming in political power of people who were actually talking about national interests before global interests. Donald Trump in America being the most obvious one. So globalization was already somewhat, if not in trouble, but being questioned as a mantra. And suddenly with COVID, all the borders closed. Supply chains closed, shipping closed. Okay, airplanes flew with cargo, but they did not flow with passengers. So we had this interesting second force of right away people thinking, wait a minute, global supply chains are dangerous. What happens if something, the world stops? The pandemic stopped it. What if there's a collapse of the internet, of digital communications? What happened if something else? So this was another reminder of the need to be strong locally. And finally, people sat at home. People sat at home together with their families. Some had good conditions for this. Some had less good working conditions for this. But this also emphasized the point that actually the core of even the family and the house is something that's so central for the way we are organized. So these forces reminded us that while we sometimes get organized in very many intricate ways, in the end, sometimes life can very quickly throw us back to the local, core, individual, family cells of, let's say, existence, and even our houses are such an important thing. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind as we think about how we chart our way forward. Because these lessons will not immediately fall away, and countries will be very careful to open up, again, their borders, to remove all of their tariffs. We see that China is actually saying, let us stay closed for another year. Because as many of you know, China's focus on economic growth for the next period is going to be domestic consumption driven. It is not going to be necessarily trade or export. The last decade, several decades was investment driven. They're making the emphasis on consumption driven. So this context is important. Now, as we think about, of course, the economic context, there's many economists also to come and speak. I will not duplicate them, but let's just remember what happened. Consumption fell in 2020 in the United States by 26%. In the UK by 26%. In the US by 11%. There was never such a decline of consumption except in wartime. Governments right away got very worried and they put in 16% of global GDP as cash or other infusions into the economy. Again, a massive infusion, nothing compared to what had happened before. But people didn't spend that money. Savings grew by 50% in Germany, by twice in the UK and the US. And now we all know what is happening. People are beginning to spend that money, and inflation is beginning to skyrocket. Governments are beginning to think about how we bring in interest rates to slow this down. And again, we're getting a situation where people are basically absorbing shocks from the outside, because a lot of this inflation is supply chain driven, a lot of this is global commodity volatility driven, and countries are really struggling to understand what to do. So this time, on the one hand, it's a pendulum, but it's a very, I don't think since the 1970s, colleagues will correct me, that this fear of stagflation has been around the planet, where we have basically lack of economic growth, potentially because people are not spending more, or the pandemic is happening, or because interest rates go up and people the economy slows down, and also the inflationary pressures. So these were the short-term effects. Now, what else do we all need to take into account? The climate. The climate, we all talk about this, we all know this, but can I just make one comment on this, that the volatility of what's going on in the weather is beginning to cost real money. So this is not only a commitment, a noble cause of trying to get to the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario. It is not only something that is the triumph, let's say, maybe of the younger generation, but for example, already we started seeing real losses. In heat waves in Europe in 2003, as long ago as that, $15 billion in losses. Australia, 8 years ago, $6 billion in productivity losses because of heat waves. South Africa had a drought a few years ago, 15% agriculture output decline. China flooding in 2017, $5 billion in direct economic loss. The Himalayan glaciers melting, this could reduce water supply to 250 million people. And there is estimates and modeling shows that by 2030, and by 2050, we may move to damages in the tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to infrastructure. This means that the new thing is we need to plan for emergencies better. So this is a new challenge. How do you get ready for emergencies? Technology and digital. We all, again, know these terms. Now, our modeling has shown that by 2030, not by 2050, by 2030, already hundreds of millions of jobs could be threatened by automation. I remember going somewhere in New York City or in America into a store only 3 or 4 years ago and being surprised for the first time to see the automatic checkout machine. I was quite also surprised, to be honest, in Moscow last week to see that at a local store. This spread of some professions are just going to disappear. Now, mankind has always lived through that. We know that in the 1830s, people were worried in England that, machines will replace hand weaving of carpets. And they did. But new professions arose, managing and building the machines. So this is inevitable, but again, it is accelerating. So what can we do and finally, the social, and the colleagues have mentioned this already, the social stress is growing. I mentioned globalization has brought growth of inequality, not just between nations, within nations. And for example, one statistic, according to surveys, or not even according to modeling, in the 1950s, 95% of Americans, people born, let me restate it, of people who were born in the 1950s in America, 95% ended up being better off than their parents. This number has continued to decline to the level that where in 1985 people are born, only half are likely to be better off than their parents. And the other half are potentially going to be the same or even worse off. That is a massive political, social challenge, which exactly trumps the question of just GDP maximization. It talks about the increasing importance of integrating social factors and wealth distribution. So what are countries doing, and what should Azerbaijan do? Well, in the short term, countries, of course, as we said, threw money at consumers. They threw money at small and medium-sized enterprises, and they have begun large investment programs into infrastructure. Again, just some figures. Beijing is planning to invest in China until 2025, $2 trillion into new infrastructure. By the way, this new infrastructure is not just houses and bridges. They've built that before. They know this can create bubbles. Not all physical infrastructure like this is used. There's a lot of emphasis now on data centers, on 5G systems. The UK is planning to invest £100 billion per year, at least in 2022, on broadband, but also on traditional infrastructure, which is not as modern as the Chinese one, on rail, on roads, on cities. Also, the UK and many European nations are putting money into the green transition, investing into net zero approaches, through funds, through direct spending, through subsidies. Another direction is reskilling and teaching. For example, the Prime Minister in the UK introduced a lifetime skills guarantee. This is supposed to, and I don't know how detailed it is already, but the idea is to give people access to education and training they will need for all of their life. We cannot assume to plan about what skills will be needed in 2035 or 2040. And it's a very important shift from saying that I can always plan the future. And you know that our countries of Russia and Azerbaijan and Poland and others went through the period when we all thought that we could plan, have come to a situation where we can only create enablers and systems for people and the economy to respond to the challenges and opportunities that we don't even know today what they will be. But this emphasis on not just determining which skills we will need, but saying that we will always just have enough skill building capacity is an interesting idea. Of course, also innovation, new business building, startups, UK $2 billion program, $3 billion program for those who lost their work. So the story in the end, I would also maybe add the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates said, you know, we will put in a lot of money into research and development, into the green and digital. And they said that out of $2 trillion investments that they were planning to $2 trillion over 5 years, half will go into these new topics. By the way, also the Emirates said, look, we're going to make life very comfortable for people to interact with the state. We will digitize all services of the government to be accessible from anywhere, at any time, at people's personal devices by 2023. They appointed a head of digital for the government. Many countries do this because they really believe that this is one way you can really help people. So as we think about what to do in Azerbaijan, well, first of all, of course, we have to understand what do we think about oil. I think it's a false choice to say, is oil a curse or is oil an opportunity? Oil is a resource which is finite. Probably that is a good consensus. So probably you should use the oil while you have it. And as you know, the old saying that the Stone Age did not end because the world ran out of rocks, it is quite possible that the oil age will not end because oil ran out under the ground. We know that there's just debates about the peak moment, but this is a transitionary period. You probably need to think, do I need to define my new industries and what are my competitive advantages? Well, I could say the following, a lot of countries these days say, I want to have IT clusters. I will have IT here. But what happened as people became more mobile, it's both a threat and an opportunity. People can work from a distance, which means that people, if they like to live in Azerbaijan, they will work here for your companies And for other companies, they will move from abroad here. But if they don't like to live in Azerbaijan, even your people will move away. So the fight to create an attractive environment for people, for young people, the fight to create a real middle class rather than just the very rich and the workers, the importance to invest in the main needs of man, education, health, safety, food. Politics probably comes after that. The importance to make that is how nations will compete. I, by the way, think it's hard to predict exactly which industry to work with and so on, but of course, probably you have more of a natural advantage in topics like agriculture, in areas like tourism, and potentially in some of the areas of logistics, than maybe, in high tech or IT. I think also for countries that are not the major domestic markets, that are not huge economic superpowers, it is important to assume that while this anti-globalizing winds are in the air, creating partnerships and networks is very important. And it's a big difference, because globalization in its most radical form implies that everything will be produced there where it makes the most sense to produce it. But networks and partnerships, for me, implies much more being plugged in and connected in value chains, in the knowledge chains, in technology communities, probably a very important mindset for countries in your part of the world and of your size. And finally, one thing I would say is that culture and the new generation. Research has shown, our research has shown others, that up to 40% of employees, in response to the question, would you change your job, say, yes, maybe I will. Research shows that while 2 generations ago, people thought about lifetime employment, and the last generation, it was about 3 jobs during one's career on average. In the future, it could be as much as 5 or 7 different jobs in a person's professional career. People, and the young people, probably in all generations, but it's certainly true today, do not want corporations. They do not want bureaucracy. People want to be flexible. They want to be their own bosses. And the ability to make your iconic companies, to make your best employers also modernize themselves, including your state-owned companies, to be less, let's say, ministerial, traditional, hierarchical, and let's say not hurried, to be more flexible in how you pull in talent, to how you work with talent, which models you allow. This will be an absolutely imperative way to compete going forward. These are some of the interesting issues I hope we can discuss during this forum, and thank you yet again for inviting to participate today.